All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the third session of The Art of the Sugya, an exploration of the literary genius of the Talmud. This class is intended to try to provide an introduction to the ways that the Talmud thinks, the ways that the Talmud wants us to think. Um, what's so interesting about the way the Talmud works is that, one of the classic statements about it is that it is not a law code, right? The Talmud is not primarily about practical results, practical conclusions, but rather the Talmud is it's really like a classic textual version of the saying, it's about the journey, not about the destination. It's really about teaching us how to be in that mode of exploration, that mode of critical inquiry. That having been said, it's doing so by taking concrete practical cases. So it does have, I think, practical import for us, but in the sense of providing us with wisdom rather than necessarily providing us with a specific halachic conclusion. Now, there are halachic conclusions that come out of it, but often those are the latest version of the strand in the text. Really, the Talmud's essence is not about the bottom black line law. The Talmud's essence is about how we get there. So the topic we're going to be looking at tonight is one that I think has a lot of practical contemporary ramifications and resonance. It's about the question of what we are accorded or what we are owed in society, what respect or dignity is accorded to us, and here's where the halachic question comes in, is that something that is fundamental, or is it something that you can negotiate, right? Is it something you can opt into or out of? Or is it something that is more basic than that? And there's a certain maybe cost of seeing it as something that you can negotiate away. So I'm going to start with a couple questions, and please unmute yourself if you have some ideas about it. I'm going to share a screen so we can all be on literally the same page. 1 second. Okay, great. All right, can everyone see that okay? Great. So this is, we'll be looking at one specific sugya in Maseches Kedushin near the end of the book, which is the tractate about betrothal, about engagement, right? The first stage of the Jewish ceremony of marriage. But, as again, with every Talmudic tractate, it's really about a whole bunch of topics that come in that are ancillarily related to the main topic or something that is a tangent that the rabbis go on. Another Masechta in the order having to do with family law called Kesubos or Ketuvot, the one that's about the second stage of getting married. It's called actually by many people Shas Katan, a mini Talmud, because it is renowned for how many tangents it goes on and how it exemplifies every version of what you need to know about the Talmud, right? It's a great example of how it's never really just about the theme or the topic. It's really about the ways that the rabbi think. So, the question I want to start with is, whom are we obligated
much more difficult to negotiate your way through than Kiddushin. Shir I was in, we studied it for almost half a year, and then we just gave up. It was just too hard.
It is a classic yeshivish Masechta. It's one that's really kind of, you make your bones when you learn it. So here's a question I want to start with. So we're in Kedushin. It has a number of very famous sugyas in it, although we're not gonna, especially the first one is actually especially famous. But we're gonna actually get to something that's one of the more side topics. So and it has to do with family law, but family writ large, not just about the laws of how do you get married, but actually the laws about how your family should be regulated in a way, right? Because the classic example of the mitzvahs around respect have to do with your, right? I mean, when I say honor thy blank and blank, what comes to mind?
Your parents.
Yeah, exactly. Your parents, right? Your mother and father, your father and mother, and your parents. And that's and we're going to see that as a paradigmatic example, but only one amongst many. So before we get inside, we can start outside. And I want to ask a general question, namely, whom are we obligated to respect? And don't think as like a Talmud person. Just think as you. Like, whom are we obligated to respect?
Like everybody?
Okay, so very very nice. Everybody. Okay, great. Everybody. Now, who in particular are we obligated to respect?
As you mentioned before, I mean, we're absolutely obligated. Kaved imecha
Yeah,
if you have,
yeah.
so it's definitely your parents you're obligated to respect. I believe that there's at points you're supposed to respect anyone with great learning. I
Mhm.
think that comes up. In general, Menschlichkeit means respecting other people, but that's not halachically necessarily.
Right. So maybe, all right. So here we have the difference between, and this is important thinking about law, right? And this is the
Right.
difference between what you are required to do and what would be nice, right? I think we all agree it would be nice to respect everybody, to honor everybody. But, to think about it in terms of like the way that law does, particular obligations, right, that you actually have to fulfill. Right.
The
It's not
stranger and the convert.
1 second. It's not just a sentimental orientation, right? Like what's interesting about this, I mean, I guess that's the question. When we say respect somebody, is that just a question of emotions, right? Are you supposed to just like in some way regard them with respect? Or does respect, and here's the kind of answer, here's the corollary question, does respect have certain practical, right, demands and claims it makes on you?
Halachically, with your parents, it does. I
Right. So
mean, you're supposed to make sure they're clothed and fed, and the limits are like if your parents tell you to do something against halacha, then you can't follow that, but you can follow it in a respectful manner.
Right.
But if they're like mamish v'sha'im, then you got a whole other thing to deal with.
Rishoyim arurim, right?
Yeah,
Cursed wicked ones.
exactly.
Yeah. So right. So those are some very famous sections of the Talmud in which it's like, your parents cannot obligate you to break the Torah. But we're not getting into the particulars of what you are obligated to do. But the question we're going to actually question we're going to do is like a flip side of that question. It'll be interesting to see what it means, what it entails. But what is okay? So I think it might be hard. It might be challenging maybe for the modern ear in some ways, or in like kind of the contemporary society. But there's a benefit towards codifying, right? Concretizing what particularly we are obligated to do when we say we respect somebody, because otherwise it can just like evaporate into just a general sentiment of like, oh yeah, like treat that person with respect. But when the rubber hits the road, right? What's the substance of your relationship? What are you really gonna do when you have to do it? And here we have like the notion of like respect isn't just again like an orientation. Respect seems to be actually specific obligations you have to somebody, right? The way there's a famous ethics book by Thomas Scanlon called What We Owe to Each Other. And that I think is a really good book to help us understand the rabbinic mind, because it's not just about these general principles. It's really about concrete claims and concrete demands that we make of each other. That's what society is made out of. All right, we owe something to each other, and that in some ways I think maps to like a halachic mind in the sense of it's based in chiyuv, right? It's based in obligation, like we have a chiyuv when it comes to praying, keeping Shabbos, right? All these like religious things. But in a way, like halacha sees everything the same way. Everything is about chiyuv or not chiyuv. Are you obligated or are you not obligated? Even in human relationships, right? It has the same force of yes, that's actually an obligation that's upon you, not just something that's nice to do, or not just something that's virtuous to do, but something you have to do. Right? It's kind of like the classic difference between like, let's say, Christian charity and Jewish tzedakah. Right? Charity comes from the Greek word charitas, which is also from the word, which we have the word grace, and it means an act of generosity. It's an act of love, and that's very beautiful. But tzedakah, right, which is from the word of tziduk, right, which is about justice, is actually about fulfilling your obligations to society, specific to those who have a right to make a claim on social on like the dole, right? They have a right to go and get their payout, their welfare check. They have a right to it, and you have an obligation to contribute. Right, so that's a very different way of thinking about what tzedakah entails. It's not about your virtues; it's about your obligations. Similarly, when we think about respecting persons. It's not, again, just about your being a good person and you're respecting them, but rather the question is, what do you owe them? And then again, when the rubber hits the road, what does that mean, right? How is that really going to impact your life? One of the recurrent like leitmotif phrases we'll see every class, every class stands on its own, but it's building, right? So in this class, one of the takeaways is going to be, we're introducing everyone to like the literature, the rhetoric of the Talmud. And the phrase we're going to see again and again, which is a classic Talmudic phrase, is lamai nafkamina, which literally means what comes out of this. But idiomatically, what it means is what's the practical import here? Right? What is the practical takeaway? And nafka means to exceed or to leave from something. It's like the word yotze, but the metaphor means what comes out of this, right? Like what, if you were to compare two things, if they were equal, then there's nothing that's excessive. So the question is, what's the extra thing here? What's necessary about this that actually otherwise it would not be, you would not have realized that, right? That's the nafkamina. That's what's coming out of it. Well, we'll see that come up. Okay, so let's get started with this. Unlike previous classes, we're actually just going to jump right into the Talmud. There's no Mishnah. This is really just the rabbis riffing. So they start by citing an early tradition. They start by saying, and they cite exactly the pasuk, the verse that we were thinking of. Kavod v'chaved imecha, right? Respect your father and your mother. Respect your parents. But it also says, Kaved es Hashem mehoncha. Honor God with your wealth. Now that's very interesting because the analogy here, right, is between parents and who?
And God.
And God, the parents.
Two creators.
Parents.
Your
Yes.
parents created you and God created the world.
Okay, so I mean, it's a very, it's in some ways it's an intuitive analogy, and in other ways it's a daring analogy, right? Between, intuitively in the sense of like humans created you and God creates everything. Great. So there's a notion in which creation, procreation, etc. But it's a daring analogy in the sense of comparing humans to God. It's usually the contrast, not the comparison, right? Oh, a king of flesh and blood, blah blah blah. But the king of kings, something else, right? But here it's actually saying no, we can learn out how to understand our parents and obligations thereof from God. But we'll see the way in which this will keep on coming back. We'll revisit it. But here's the thing. So respect your father and mother, but we don't have any specifics. So where do we learn the specifics from? From this intertext. Respect, honor God with your wealth. And just as the latter involves financial loss, so should the former. How did the Talmud suddenly now recontextualize the question about respect? What's the motivating, what's the driving question now? Or what's the test case that we're going to keep on coming back to? Because what the Talmud is emphasizing here is that when the rubber hits the road, what does it mean to respect somebody? It means you go into the red. Right, on the balance sheet, right? You could say, listen, I'm filing Chapter 11 bankruptcy. You can't come after my creditors anymore. I'm not solvent, right? I've dissolved the Joshua Schwartz Incorporated. I'm sorry, you can't come after me anymore. I'm protected. But no. What it means to have an obligation of respect to your parents is that you actually are obligated to take a loss. Or are you? We'll be exploring this. But that's the claim, right? So it's not about the particulars, like the positive particulars that Lauren was mentioning before. Okay, you have to make sure they have clothing. You have to make sure they have money for a nursing home or something like that. But rather the question is, what defines this obligation? It's that when the chips are down, you still have to stand up. Right? You still have to fulfill your obligation in some way. But here's the challenge to it, right? But if honoring the parent is from the parent's wealth, then what impact? Then lamai nafkamina. What is the impact? What's the import of this principle? Let's clarify. Okay, so you live in Toronto. Real estate prices are very high. You can't afford to move out of your parents' house until, I don't know, you're 27, 28, right? Until you get married, something like that, right? You're living, so who pays for the food? Your parents pay for the food. Right, and who pays for the clothes? Parents pay for the clothes, right? So what does it mean in some way to actually be, what's the labor required of you in this context? Maybe you could say that you don't have to be dipping into your own funds to be honoring your parents, but rather what are you contributing instead? What is your contribution? If it's not capital, what is it? This is my Marxist side coming out. If it's not capital, what's the other thing of value?
Work.
Labor.
Labor. Exactly. You are now the executor of your parents' trust. Right? So there's two ways of thinking about how you're obligated. One, and this is have people heard of brisk? Not the iced tea.
You mean
Although like the iced tea, it is also cold and leaves a bad taste in your mouth.
do you mean like the Litvish
Yeah,
system
so
of,
it's a certain Talmudic reasoning school from Lithuania. It's where the Rav comes from, right? Rav Soloveitchik, doyen of mid-20th century modern Orthodoxy. He's a descendant of Rav Chaim Brisk, right? The Brisker Rav. And what the Brisker method is it always tries to break everything down into binaries, right? Into two ideas that are playing off of each other. And a classic binary is the Hefza and the Gavra. Hefza, chafetz in Hebrew, it's the thing. Gavra, gever, is the person. So one way of thinking about kaved avicha v'timecha, respect your parents, is it's on the Hefza. It's on your money. It's on your stuff, right? They have a lien on your bank account and they can make a withdrawal from it because you owe money to them. That's what it means for you to respect them. You have to give them your cash money. Or thinking about it from the Gavra side, what is it that they have a claim on? It's not your money, but rather your labor, your person. And they can say, you need to spend this many hours or what have you, organizing our affairs, making sure that you're dispersing the payments appropriately to the nursing home or something, right? Whatever it is, right? Once your services are required, and we assume like the context of this is that in their old age, right? Like this is when they can't be taking care of themselves. I mean, I'll say that like, not to get too personal, but my grandparents, when they were in their later years, my parents, one of whom is on this class, my parents spent countless hours organizing their affairs, making sure they were well taken care of, or like managing their accounts, making sure that they had everything that they needed, and it set an incredible example. It was a really lived example of kaved avicha v'timecha. I mean, there was money changing hands too, but it was a really good crystal example of what the Talmud is talking about here. Right? Then when we talk about something of value that's given to someone else, we don't want to be small-minded, right? One way of thinking about it, and a real way it's considering, is that it doesn't just mean your money. I mean, how paltry is that? But it means, in a sense, your services, your time, your efforts, right? That could be a completely reasonable way of reading what it means to honor your parents. So just to summarize, we have two live readings now of what respect your parents means. One is drawing from this pasuk, right? Saying it's comparable to honor God from your wealth. Thus, what it means to respect your parents is that you owe them your funds, right? You need to spend your money to make sure they're well taken care of. The second live reading is that perhaps it is not your funds that you need to dip into, but rather what is required of you is your services. That you need to be, that the funds that are available for respecting your parents is not your money, but theirs. And what is required of you is to take care of it, right? To be laboring in that way, to be providing your services. And indeed, as the Talmud says right here, what is it then that you're donating? Loss of work. And what does it mean when it says loss of work? Let's just make sure we get the language, like lebitol malacha. Well, when it says loss of work, let's just make sure we translate it into terms that make sense to us.
Like your time away from doing other things.
Exactly. Yes, like, you work a full-time job, right? And that requires what, eight hours a day, 5 days a week, 40 hours a week, right? I mean, for like the classic job, 40 hours a week. But let's say actually, and you spend 8 hours a day sleeping, right? 7 days a week. That's 56 hours. But let's say like what your parents require of you is going to be eating into one of those things, right? You're going to be less, you're not going to be as well rested, or you're going to have to take like a half day because you need to make sure that your parents are well taken care of, right? That is, that, I mean, in a sense, that is your money. That's because you're losing opportunity to make it, but it's like you're losing money futures, right? It's not that you're losing your capital. Okay. But we have now, again, 2 live readings in terms of what it means for what's the skin in the game when it comes to respecting your parents. Is it your stuff, right? Your money, or is it your time? Okay, clear? Good. Questions, objections, insights? Okay, so here we have now, as I hope has become expected by now. Here we have the rabbis continue, like kind of pulling the thread, right? Keep on trying to poke and to prod and to make sure we get to every single little nook and cranny of this idea. Okay, so come in here, Tashma. 2 brothers, or here we have 2 partners. We spent a long time talking about 2 partners. All right, 2 brothers, or 2 siblings, 2 siblings, 2 business partners, right? Co-owners of some kind of business venture, a parent and a child, or a teacher and their disciple. How can we define this relationship? They can redeem each other's second tithe, or they can feed each other the poor tithe. Now, is anyone familiar with what Meiser Sheni is? Second tithe? Okay, great. So here's a great opportunity to learn about Jewish taxes. Aren't we excited? Taxes. All right, so the taxes that you owe are to, generally speaking, the temple, right? The temple is it's not just the religious center of the ancient Jewish society, it's the financial center as well. The first tithe goes to the priests, it goes to the Levites. Why? Because the Levites are not allowed to be landowners. They are always on the dole, right? They are publicly supported. They're public servants and they're supported by public funds, just like today's public servants supported by tax, right? This is exactly the same. That's your first tithe. You owe that every single year of your life, except for the sabbatical year, because you're not making any money that year. Second tithe happens on years 1, 2, 3, and 5. 1, 2, 4, and 5. Sorry, 1, 2, 4, and 5 of the sabbatical cycle. Don't worry too much about that. What you are obligated to do is you take another tenth of what you make, and instead of donating it, what you need to do is bring it to Jerusalem. And your obligation is that you eat it and enjoy it in Jerusalem. Or let's say you're a farmer, right? Unless you have a bumper crop. So you already took a tenth of that, donated it to the Levites. Then you have to take another tenth of what's left and bring it to Jerusalem. But you just made tons and tons of produce. You had a great year. Is it worth it for you to bring all that produce to Jerusalem? What can you do instead?
You redeem it for money, and then you use the money later for what you eat when you're in Jerusalem, when you eventually go there.
Precisely. Thank God for money. This is why money was invented, right? This way I don't have to carry around doubloons, right? Originally money was based on weight. So it was give me an eighth of that coin. Here you go. It's an eighth. What's a quarter? It's a quarter of a coin. But nowadays we have a piece of paper. And it's look, this is $1 billion on this one piece of paper. It's incredible. It's like a miracle. So you can take, and instead of bringing the tons of produce, you redeem it for money, and it's much easier. You bring your wallet with you to Jerusalem, you take that money, and you pay for food there, and you eat the food there. Except, for anyone who is a day trader, if you're dealing with real-world property, the value doesn't stay constant. Which means that, to make sure that you're not going to be a situation in which you sold it on the cheap, and then your money, you got a better deal when you brought the money to Jerusalem, To make sure that what you're actually redeeming it for is what you will be spending in Jerusalem, you have to pay a fee. Okay? So you have to pay an extra 1/5. Point is, if you redeem the money, you have to pay a 1/5 penalty to make sure you have an overage that covers any loss. Okay, that's fairly simple. But what defines this relationship here? These close relationship, two siblings, two partners, parent and a child, master and disciple. It's like they're the same person. Because one of the partners in that relationship is allowed to redeem the other's stuff and not have to pay a fee. Right? The fee is to make sure that nobody's going to be cheating anyone else. But here, you view them as if they're one unit. Similarly, the 3rd and the 6th year of the cycle, instead of doing the second tithe, you actually give the second tithe to the poor. And in this case, what are you allowed to do? You're allowed to donate that poor tithe to your parent, sibling, or teacher, or student, or what have you. You're allowed to see them as someone you're donating it to. Now that's interesting, because what's losing out, right? If you make the decision to pay your poor tithe to your chavrusa, right, to your study partner, or to your teacher, these classes are free. I'm just saying. If you decide to give the poor tithe to your sibling, to your partner, or whatever, who's losing out? The poor.
The poor.
Right. So, but also, what's the implication of that? Who are you treating as the charity case?
Your partner is then becoming like the poor.
But let's go back to our original case. Your parent.
Yeah. Okay. Could be your parent, your teacher, but yes, your parent.
Okay. So now we have an example, right, in which the Talmud is saying you are allowed to take money that you have earmarked for a certain donation and instead use it to sustain your parent. Which side is that a support for? Is that a support for you owe your parents money, or is that a support for you owe your parents time? How is the Talmud using this other case?
It helps you with your money. If you don't have enough money, it's one way of helping, because you don't have to worry about the Maser Sheni and the Maser for the poor.
Exactly.
So, yeah. What if your parents are rich?
Well, then,
Wait, if you're not, but your parents are, do you still owe them that?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, no, this is a case in which they don't have money.
Okay.
Yeah. And the question, in a sense, is, are they allowed to treat your bank account as theirs, right? When it comes to like having to help them out, do they have a lien on your bank account? Is the question, in a sense. Right. So exactly. So this is support for that. But just as you said, right, the money's already earmarked. So would you say, like, this isn't really an ideal performance of this mitzvah, right? As the Gemara is just about to say, isn't this a support that you do then support your parents from your money? No, because instead, this is actually about additional support. Okay, I mean, fine. Additional here meaning you've already done it, right? You've paid out of your actual bank account, and now this double dipping is like just for extra stuff that they need. This isn't for your primary obligation. This is for ancillary, extraneous needs. They want the flat screen TV, right? They want something good. They want something sweet on top of it. Fine. But then why does Rabbi Yehuda say a curse on anyone who sustains their parents using the poor tithe? Now, before we get into the technical aspects of this, why do you think he's cursing you?
Well, if you're taking money away from the poor so you can buy a flat screen TV, like,
yeah, no, that seems kind of shiesty.
yeah,
That's nice.
Like if it was for the necessities of life, then that makes sense. But
Right. Although, I mean, so let's even go back to the original idea that actually it is for just like your basic obligations. Why would he still say maybe you're cursed? Why does he have an issue with this?
Maybe because you're not fulfilling an obligation to the poor. However, you are fulfilling an obligation to your parents, and I guess it really depends on how financially needy you are. But
Hmm.
but the
Right. So
poor
okay.
lose.
So let's good point. Let's accept the situation in which you have a limited amount of funds, and the only way you can fulfill this is by double dipping.
So I can't see why he would
But let's say that's
condemn
not.
you.
But let's say it's not the case, right? Or let's say you have available funds to both give your poor tithe and pay your parents off.
Then you'd be cheating if if you took away from the poor.
Yes. So on one hand, right, we have the poor side, right? This is not fair, not nice to the poor, and you're being a stingy miser. On the other side, though, also, what kind of relationship do you have with your parents, right? Like, what kind of is this what it means? I mean, go back to the original question. Like we lose, we can't lose sight of the fact that while this is about practical obligations, like how much money that you maybe need to chip into the pot to make sure they're well taken care of, it's also about values, right? And the value here is you are respecting them. And if the way that you are supporting them in their dotage is to take money out of the hands of the poor to do so, or put it a different way, money in your sense you're double gifting, right? You're re-gifting this tithe to them, right? It's not like you like are setting aside money makudash, right, designated for them. You are taking money that you have to be donating anyway, and that's directing it towards them. Right? It's like getting a gift basket and then giving it to somebody that you like. Do you like them that much? Right? Re-gifting means you don't care about the person you're giving it to. You know you care about somebody when you like spend time out of your day poring over Etsy and finding the perfect like misshapen slipper to give them because you know that they'll like it for whatever reason. Right? Because it shows that there's something personal about the act of giving. But if what you're doing is because you were given, like, you went to a party and everyone got the same gift basket and you give them, like, the argan oil shampoo that you got in the bag. I mean, yeah, like, I'm going to come home from a hotel and I'm going to give you a bunch of little bottles of shampoo. You're not going to feel appreciated, right? So, point is, re-gifting the tithe, or rather directing the money rather than giving it, right, shows that how you're relating to the mitzvah of respecting your parents is not so substantively, right? You're not really respecting them. You're just making sure you get it out of the way.
I'd like to say something here because it's important. I had to do that uh, for both my father-in-law, uh, uh, my mother-in-law, my father, and my mother. And it was extremely difficult and it was hard, but I had to do that. And now both my children are doing that for me. They're helping me by taking care of uh, all the extra little work things that I no longer can do as well as I used to. So that's a personal how it went for me. I've done it, and now my kids are doing it.
Thank you for giving us like a concrete example of that, Eric. I appreciate it. So that's like a way of thinking, helping us bring this question out of theory and into real life, right? That it's the way in which, I mean, and I think actually that's a great comment to make. Thank you for making it, because it helps us also see the other side of this question, which we'll get to soon. Namely, why are these relationships of respect so important? Right? Because they set up things in a specific kind of way, specifically for people who aren't able to arrange things for themselves. So it's not so different. No wonder no wonder tithing came in. The point of tithes, and ideally the point of taxes, right, is to make sure that you have a fund of money, right, a pool of money, a pool of money that is available to make sure that things are able to get done specifically when people aren't able to arrange things for themselves, right? The poor, they don't have land to farm, right? But they have a right to food. They have a right to eat. They have a right not to starve to death. The priests provide all these services for the public, but they don't have their own house, their own land, so they need to be supported. And this system of respect is setting up a world in which your parents, or other people that we'll get to eventually, are insured, right? It's insurance. They are insured that like specifically when they're not able to take care of themselves, when those work things that you're not able to do for yourself anymore, that these things will be taken care of for you. So you're paying into society by respecting your parents, and then society pays back to you when your children provide you the same respect, right? So the point is that we're talking about this like this technical legal question, or maybe as a philosophical question, of like, what do we owe each other? But it's also a social question or a political question. How is society based in these basic relationships, and what are those relationships ensuring occur so society does not to be too dramatic, but does not fall apart, right? You'll hear a lot of people ring the alarm bells about like changing roles in society and worrying about the death of the family and things like this. And while a lot of those kind of comments can come off as a bit like a Jeremiad, or something a bit panicky sounding, there's still insight there that the structures we have in society do things, right? They're functional, and they make sure that certain things get done. So here what we have is that parents are taken care of in their old age. And only if we have this system set up, and only if parents have the authority to say, you owe this to me, if, God forbid, let's say someone defaults on their obligation, right? I mean, think of it like that, right? Like, in a way, you can take your child to court. God forbid that we would ever have to do that. But this makes sure that you have a legal backing to make sure that you will be taken care of in your old age, right? It's, in a way, this is the first Social Security. Okay, just to bring it into contemporary terms, right? And we don't see Social Security as just like a charitable donation. Social Security makes sure that like when Social Security was invented, it cut elder poverty in like fractions. Like the old were some of the poorest in society, and it has responded robustly to elder poverty. It didn't solve it, obviously, but it has responded quite well to it. So this is the first version of that, right? To make sure that people in their older years, when they're not producing in the economy anymore, still have a right to be sustained and supported. Okay. So here we have a very colorful example. And the question is, again, this is a way of framing it in concrete terms. So Tashma, Sha'alu Rabbi Eliezer, right? We asked the famous Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus, we asked him, Ad heichan kibud av ve'em. What's the extent of respecting your parents? Right? Give me the test limit for it. Right? Limit X arrow parent. Right? Like, what is the limit for respecting your parent? And what's the example? If your parent takes their purse and throws it into the sea. Do not read the next line. What do you think the question is?
Do you still owe them support, financial support?
Aha, okay, interesting. So maybe that is then about it. Maybe it's about the money. Ooh, ooh. That's all I want. Or what? Okay, what are other ways of thinking about it? No spoilers. All right, imagine you're taking a seaside walk with your parent or with your sibling, and they just, in a fit of pique, take their wallet. Or take their, did you see this thing? Conor McGregor, the MMA fighter, he's a very successful mixed martial arts fighter. And there's a picture going around online right now of him with a $1 million watch. $1 million watch. All right, so imagine you're hanging out with Conor McGregor, walking down the seaside, holding hands, or whatever you guys are doing. And for whatever reason, he takes this $1 million watch and throws it into the ocean. What would you do? Kathy?
I would jump into the ocean.
You know what? You're not wrong. You're not wrong. How might you react? Maybe it's a different way of putting it.
I have similar, another example from my life in which my father was in his latter days investing in some very spurious investments.
I was just going to use
And
this example.
it was
Great. Yeah.
equivalent of throwing the money into the sea.
Yeah, effectively.
And I tried to ask him to stop, but in the end, I couldn't, and I just had to accept that was he had the right to do it, and it was my loss and my brother's loss.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So that's the other side of it, right? So on one hand, maybe as Lauren said, maybe it's about money, right? So maybe they let's say they waste their money on something silly. Like the question is, can you say, listen, it's not on me, it's on them because they made a big mistake. And maybe you could say no, that you know you can't say that. So that's definitely a possibility. Another side of it is that you're not allowed to make fun of them. All right, and that's the answer that the Gemara gives, right? That if your parent throws their purse into the sea, you cannot shame them for it. You just need to accept it. So now, I want us to pay attention because, like, the Gemara will in 1 second bring it back to a material question, like a question about money. But do we see the moving target? That sometimes we moved from respect being a question of finances to a question of labor, and now it's back to being, actually now it is an emotional question, because what does it mean to respect your parents? Is that you allow them to make silly mistakes. Right, so one thing I wanted to say is, like, we can see two things happening. One is that there's different versions of this conversation that could have happened, but we can also see how the editor of the Talmud is trying to corral it and bring it back to this more concrete financial question, because now the way it's going to respond to that is say, okay, fine, but if we go according to number one reading, in which you owe your parents your funds, right, that they can make a claim on your money, then what's the loss here? They wasted their money, not yours. So by respecting them and not making fun of them or whatever, you're not losing anything. You're letting them lose.
But
But the
if
point is,
you, oh, sorry, Catherine. If you are obligated to support your parents, then aren't you losing something in that now you're financially obligated to them
Okay, it could be.
or responsible for them?
It could be. Let's say that they bankrupted themselves or something like that, God forbid. Okay. But think how else? How else are you financially connected to your parents?
Like through inheritance.
Yeah, precisely. You know, like it's, like, I brought you into this world, I can take you out of it. It's, like we're wasting your, this is, or like, like what do? You open up like a bank account, right? And like, this is your college fund, right? Like there's a stream between you and your parents. The point of parents is that they're supposed to provide for their children, right? So you're like, you're throwing away my Yerusha, right? You're throwing away my inheritance. And the point is that, and here's the kind of the nafkamina again, is that they are throwing away your inheritance, and you can't do a darn thing about it. That's respect. Right, so interestingly, it's like demarcating the line between you and them, and you recognize that while you owe things to them, you're not in the driver's seat. And that's a very interesting dynamic here, right? And again, like thinking about the way in which this communicates certain social values is that there's a real risk, right? Like, let's say you live in a society in which the market controls everything. Who could imagine such a thing, right? And such that if you are not a producing member of the economy, like, let's say, a baby or somebody who's retired, you can imagine a person who would say, listen, now you don't have a right to anything anymore because you're not putting in, you don't get anything out. And this says, no, not quite. Because when you stop being a producing member of the economy, A, you still can make a claim on those who are your main source of labor in your household, your children. And B, you still should be treated as if you are. Right? You retiring or what have you doesn't mean you lose your respect. You don't lose your dignity when you stop justifying your worth. In other words, your worth is not earned. It's inherent. or is it? Right? So like I just want to make sure we see how we got there, right? This whole system is set up to make sure that people who could be seen as charity cases instead are actually people who can take you to court, right? Your parents are not the recipients of your generous donations. They are taking what they are owed because you owe it to them. They brought you into this world and you owe them at least this much, right? So you taking care of them in their old age is not, again, about your generosity. It's about what they are owed, except that would seem to imply then that that dignity is something that is inherent and is not something that is earned or given to you, but is something.
Okay, I have a question relating to that based on law. You can go to the civil court and have your parent declared
Non
incompetent
compos mentis.
to manage affairs, and you take over with power of attorney. Now, what is that relative to this particular part of Talmud? Are you allowed to do that?
It's a good question. We do have other cases in which people are not seen as being mentally competent. That's the term shoteh in Talmud, and in that case, yes, like your affairs are managed for you. And it's a very different case, right? Because in that case, you are not just technically a dependent, you are literally a dependent. So yeah, I mean, but right, I think that's exactly the issue, right? Is that like you can see a possibility in which someone stops producing the economy and say, oh, in a sense, they're not like able to manage for themselves. No, this isn't you taking over their life. This is you giving them what they deserve, right? One of the ways of seeing it is as you invading and taking over the life, and but this is a situation in which their dignity demands respect, right? And that's a very different dynamic. It's not one of being managed or infantilized, but rather it's one in which elders are given the respect that they deserve. Okay. There is a general principle about respecting elders called Sever Panim Yafos, or sorry, about Hadras Panei Zaken, respecting the presence of the elderly. But here again, we have the kind of specific financial obligation that children have to parents, which mirrors, right, the way in which parents have an obligation to children. As parents raise children, so are children obligated to ensure that parents can end their lives with dignity. Okay, so here we have a final example, which really brings us to the point, right? This is like, and this gets us to the crux of the question, which will take us to the second half of the Sugya. Rav Huna. So here we have, I think this might be the first time we're seeing this. This might be the first time we see evidence from a Maisa, not from Kra and not from Svara. There's a number of different ways of getting evidence. One is Torah verses, right? You go to the law book. You go to the law book of the Torah says this, great, that's proof, right? That's version 1. Version 2 is Svara, which means reason. You use your inference to try to figure out what you think the right course of action is, what the right definition is, right? The third one is precedent, ma'aseh, or a maisa, like a baba maisa, right? A story, a tale, a life story, that you look around and you see precedent. You see rabbis acting in a certain kind of way, parents and children acting in a certain kind of way, and you say, aha, that gives us proof positive of what I thought all along. Because you can look at them behaving in a certain way, and that shows that's the norm. Right? So here we are looking to precedent, to a maisa. All right. V'chi. This is like when Rav Huna ripped up silk garments before Rabbah, his son. And then he said to somebody else, probably his like servant or something, go and see if he is hopping mad. Now, what's the problem with this? What would you call this kind of parental relationship? Healthy? Not per se.
No, there's a lot of anger there.
Actually, okay, so I actually cut that part of the sugya out. It actually is saying, wait a second, you're not supposed to get mad. What's he doing? The answer is like, he was mad for like a legitimate reason, and then while he was mad about something, he ripped something. But yes, I mean, there is a question actually about like using anger to intimidate people, and that's discussed in Maseches Shabbos elsewhere. But there's a lot of rabbis do a lot of thinking. There's a sentence that everyone says from the Talmud, but it's not in the Talmud that we have, which says someone who is angry, it's like they're an idolater, right? So there's a lot of rabbinic thinking and anxiety about anger, especially when you see certain misas in which rabbis get pretty ticked off of each other, because if you are, like if you're a professional arguer and you're like at loggerheads with somebody, arguing about Torah, you're going to lose your temper sometimes when you like really have you don't feel like they're listening. Okay, but this is what the rabbis would call entrapment, right? You can't do something bad and then try to trick somebody into doing something bad. That's not their fault. That's entrapment. And what we call that in the halachic literature is lifnei iver lo titein michshol. You don't put a stumbling block before the
Blind.
Right, you don't put a stumbling block before the blind. In other words, you do not create conditions in which someone is going to harm themselves. Right? You don't create conditions in which someone's going to do an aveira, in which someone's going to do a sin. That's wrong. It's entrapment. Okay? So that seems bad. So it seems like what Rav Huna is doing is testing his son, but specifically testing him in a way in which if he did it wrong, he just damaged his soul. That's not great. And the Gemara says, wait a second. What are you talking about? Aren't you doing lifnei iver lo titein michshol? And the answer is no. And why was this a risk-free situation? Because he had diffused it already by being machal on his kavod. He had foregone his honor. So let's just make sure we get how A connects to B. What's the sin? Remember, you throw your wallet into the sea, you're not allowed to embarrass somebody. You're not allowed to get mad at them. So he rips up these valuable, chiffon pashminas or whatever, right? He loves these beautiful silk garments and worth a lot, right? Silk, we know from the Silk Road, it's a very valuable trading commodity, right? It's like a Prada bag, right? He lit his Prada bag on fire. Now, I would also get upset about that. What's the risk here? The risk is that his son might get mad at him and make him feel ashamed of himself, which is a sin because you're not allowed to disrespect your parents. But how did Rav Huna solve that situation? What did he do?
Well, it says he had forgone his honor. So is the idea that because he had already done something that wasn't honorable, I guess.
Okay, interesting.
Then he didn't deserve the honor back.
Okay, so that is quite possible. So it leaves open how he did it. So you're saying maybe like he walked down the street wearing pants backwards or something, and like now everyone knows you don't need to respect Rav Huna anymore. Other than the question,
but he did it intentionally. Like he wanted to get a rise out of his son. That's like
right.
Intentional. Like
right. Okay, you see them maybe being connected, like one's connected to the other. If you are testing your son in this way, maybe in a sense you're not concerned with your reputation anymore. In whatever way he did it, though, the Talmud is saying that Rav Huna forfeited his honor. He wrote he held up a poster saying, "You don't need to respect me anymore." Right? He pulled his son aside, and some time before he had this interaction with him, he said, "Listen, I forfeit it. I'm forfeiting my honor. You don't need to respect me anymore. You don't owe me this anymore."
Can a parent do that?
Good question, Lauren. Can a parent do that?
Because I would think that then you're preventing your children from doing their obligation. So you've got a real problem there.
Okay, very interesting. So so there is, I'm going to use the term liberal here. There's a liberal take on this, or way of reading this, in which you would say, honor is something that is accorded to you, and it's something that you can be consensually, right, intentionally opt out of. Right? There's nothing obligating you to be respected. It's something nice. And you could, and when I say liberal, what I mean is because you can have the liberty to opt out of it. It's not something required. It's something that you can decide to forego. But the problem with that is there's a few, right? Lauren mentioned just now that you are maybe, in a sense, taking away opportunities for your children's moral development, right? Like if they're going to stop respecting you, maybe that's going to damage them as developing adults.
Can I ask a question?
Please, Mom.
If Rav is asking someone else to go see if his son is mad,
Mhm.
then isn't that a different situation? If the son was mad, he's not doing this in front of his father and showing his anger to make him feel badly. He's having legitimate emotional reaction, but it's not at the expense of his father.
Great point. So before, above, the definition of it was that you don't embarrass your parent, right? You don't like shame them about it. But here you're quite right that actually it seems like he like went to his room and he's punching a pillow or something like that, right? Like it seems like he's doing this privately. But it seems like the extent of what we seem to owe our parents is to even have control over our private feelings. That's a great difference that you pointed out. It seems like it's a more robust standard here. Okay, so the question is, as was asked just a couple minutes ago, in shock and appall, can you forego your honor? That seems like we kind of, there's something visceral that seems problematic about that, right? Because if it's something that you can intentionally opt into or opt out of, then does that weaken it? Right? Does that weaken that basic social relationship? Or does that in some way impact or weaken what it's supposed to be doing? And that is exactly where we were brought to. Like, that's the motivating question that occupies the whole rest of the Sugya. The question is, so here we have Rav. So this is mostly Amoraic, right? This is mostly the rabbis from the Gemara, not the rabbis from the Mishnah. But Rabbi Eliezer, we saw above really quick with the wallet, that was Tannaitic. But okay, so Rav Yitzchak Bar Shila quotes Rav Matana, who quotes Rav Chisda, who says, Ha'av shemachal al kavodo machul. If a parent forgoes their honor is foregone. Well. Very interesting. So he seems comfortable with at least this social dynamic being one that you can opt into and opt out of. This is like the 1970s, right? In which you don't want to be their parent anymore. We're best friends, right? This is the Gilmore Girls, like version of this mitzvah, right? That you can forego the hierarchical relationship of parent and child and instead say, we're equals. Or at least we're not as hierarchical as we were before. But, says Rav Chisda, Harav shemachal al kavodo, ein kavodo machul. But a rabbi, who theoretically forgoes their honor is not foregone. So here we bring in a new relationship in which there is honor expected of the other partner. It's one we saw before about the tithe, if you remember, right? That a student or disciple owes honor and respect to their parents. To their teacher. Now, it's worth noting that the teacher-disciple relationship is not like on Zoom. Right? The rabbi-disciple relationship is thick. It's robust, it's strong, it's powerful, right? It's something that is much more than just the teacher-student relationship nowadays, right? In which you live at home and you go to school and you come back home, right? Your primary relationship is to your parents. So maybe this makes less intuitive sense to us. But back then, schooling was something that was occupied much more of your time. Parents had much more authority over their disciples' lives. So it's much more of a parental style relationship. So it makes sense that the rabbis are bringing it into this context here, or see it in this context. But if you're just not to overthink it, right? According to Rav Chisda, which relationship is more important? Parent-child or teacher-student?
According to this teacher-student, but I would have thought the parent-child would be.
Very interesting. Right, so the classic reason given for this is that parents take care of you in this world, but teachers are looking out for you for the next world. Right, that's like a little quip about it. Again, like the teacher-student
Little
relationship.
self-serving.
Hmm?
It seems a little self-serving.
Well, listen, it's not exactly, who wrote the book, right? This isn't Pirkei Avos here, right? This is the Rabbi's Talmud. Except that, we'll see this get pushed back on. Okay, so Rav Chisda says a teacher cannot forfeit their honor. A parent, though, can. Now, I mean, a way of saying, maybe that's still true today in some ways, or maybe we're like still, working this stuff out. Because again, we do have this idea of like, oh no, like that's not my mom, she's my best friend, right? We have this idea that exists in this world of a more equal relationship between parents and students, in which you have like a more collaborative relationship, in which you're still like stewarding their development, and they still are like taking care of you, but it's less hierarchical. But with the teacher-student, it seems like again, what is trying to be protected is the role, right? The role needs to be accorded a certain kind of dignity. Because if you lose that dignity, the question is, can it still work? So maybe a different way of putting it, maybe the parent-child relationship is better in the sense that it's more fungible. It's more flexible. It's more adaptable. Whereas the teacher-student relationship is one that can tolerate less like rearranging because you need to make sure to keep it in its current form. Right, it's more locked in. So it's something that occurred to me. All right, Rav Yosef though says, "Afilu harav shemachal al kavodo machul." Oh, so Rav Yosef has an even more liberal position. He says, no. Even the rabbi can forfeit their honor. Even the rabbi can. And here comes the analogy, Shene'emar, as it is said, V'Hashem haylech lifneihem yoimam. And actually, this is literally from this week's parsha. God walks before them by day. Why is that a proof text? How is that used as a proof text? Who walks before you?
Like the most honored person, right? Like you would if Queen Elizabeth were walking down the street, you would walk behind her. You wouldn't run in front of her. So the same thing.
Except that, Lauren, I'm gonna apologize. But what's this verse being used to prove, though? That the teacher can forfeit their dignity.
Yes, so the rabbi could forgo the dignity because only Hashem can't forgo dignity.
So it's a contrast.
That's how I'm understanding it.
Okay, very interesting. It's not phrased that way, though. No, that's good. So you're saying, like a king of flesh and blood, blah blah blah. But God, right? So you see like the usual contrast. But here it's being used analogously, not contrastingly. God walking before the people. Imagine someone like sweeping, right? Sweeping the carpet on the red carpet to make sure that the celebrities can walk down it, right? Imagine someone bowing and scraping to make sure that you can make your way through the path. This is your escort. This is your butler, right? God is willing to buttle you. Right? God is willing to serve you. Invert the creator-creature relationship. And if God is willing to do that, alachas kama v'kama, a rabbi can. Right? If God can, then of course a rabbi can too. Because a rabbi is God's representative on earth, right? Like teaching God's Torah. And that's exactly the pushback that he's going to get. Because Rava says back, I translated it as what the what, and I think that's a decent translation, but the literally word is hachi hashta, which means like this really? But what? Rava's like, what are you talking about? There, right in the verse, God, the world and Torah belong to God. So of course God can forfeit God's honor. Right? God's all powerful. God can do whatever God wants. Like the world and Torah belong to God. Right? All these things that we see as valuable. So of course God can forfeit because God owns it. But is the Torah the rabbis? And now we understand why maybe the rabbis should be a protected class. Because it's not, is it really about whose honor is really being protected? Now, yes, Susie, you're right. It's a little bit biased. It's a little bit prejudiced. Surprise, the Talmud is a pro-rabbi textbook. But, point being, right? Whose honor is it that Rava implies the rabbis possess? Or rather, is it who? They are stewards of honor, not possessors of honor. They're renting the honor. No, not even. They are taking care of the honor, right? They are babysitting the honor. For the rabbi to forego their honor, who's it really damaging? It might be damaging the rabbi in the sense that the rabbi doesn't get the sweet payoff when they retire. They don't have their pension anymore. Fine, but who's it really damaging?
The Torah.
The Torah, exactly. Because what is Kavod really about? It's not about the payola. What is it about?
You give the rabbi Kavod for being a representative or teaching or unpacking the Torah for you, so that you learn, and he or she is, at that time, not she, is teaching you, presenting to you Torah, being Chumash, Tanakh, the Talmud, but all of it. And if you disrespect the rabbis, then you're disrespecting Torah, which in itself, if you're going further, is disrespecting Hashem.
Okay, good. So the rabbi as a conduit, in a sense, but specifically for these things that we value: God, Torah, Hashem. Good. Okay. So what's Kavod really about? Yes, it concretizes as specific financial obligations or of your labor, right? Like one of the two. But what's it really about? It's really about what makes a claim on us. Or another way of putting it is, what do we think is important? Right? What are our priorities? To say that you owe something to somebody, right? I owe the rabbi respect. It's not because the rabbi is so great. It's because the rabbi represents what we care about. It represents what we think is important. So for the rabbi then to forego the honor that is accorded to them, it ends up having more of an impact than just, again, the rabbi losing his pension. It's really about potentially damaging the system of Torah. This is maybe a way of thinking about the laws of Shabbat. Right? The laws of Shabbat are very stringent. They're very intense. And people usually see it like, oh, like, why are they so intense? Why can't people relax? The laws of Shabbat are intense because Shabbat is something precious that needs to be protected. Shabbat has honor that we owe it. And because of that, Shabbat makes claims on our lives. Right? There's a zillion things we can't do on Shabbat, and that's a way of us saying to Shabbat, we care about you. We care about you, and we want to make sure that you don't get ruined. So, respecting your teacher, or let's say in the first case, respecting your parent, is about respecting what they represent. And when it comes to a teacher, the reason it might not be possible for the teacher to forego their honor is because they'd be, in a sense, undermining what it means for them to do their job. Because their job is not about gleaning honor. Their job is about representing something deserving of dignity, Torah. And for them to say, listen, I'm just your buddy, I'm your friend, that's our relationship. What does that then imply about what a relationship with Torah entails? It's one that you can be casual about, right? It's one you don't have to take seriously. I mean, I'll say for me, I try to have a pretty approachable demeanor. I like to have I want to make sure that the learning contexts that I help facilitate are ones in which people know that they are an equal player in the creation of, in learning Torah. But I also wear my jacket. And I try to also balance that with making sure that there is a certain amount of Kavod Torah that is fundamental to all of this. Because if I'm trying to just get along with everybody, then I end up, in a sense, trading in the dignity of Torah for my personal appeal or something like that. I am taking care of Torah as a teacher of Torah. And thus, I am responsible to something. That means I need to hold myself with a certain kind of mean or a certain kind of manner. And I don't have the liberty, maybe, to be casual about that. Maybe I don't have the right to, says Rava. Except then he goes right back and he contradicts himself. And he says, Hadar Rava, like, you know what, he thought about it again. He says, okay, fine. No, actually, a rabbi can. And why? Because what justified God foregoing God's honor? Because God is the creator of everything, and God can do whatever God wants with those things. Similarly, the challenge to it was that, what, is it the rabbi's Torah? No, it's God's Torah, and the rabbi is just leasing it. Except that now he's actually quotes another verse, Uv'torato yehege yovam v'layla. His Torah he meditates on day and night. Who's the his? Is it God's? No, says Rava, it's the rabbi's. The rabbi has, in a sense, earned Torah. The rabbi has, like, put in his hours, and now the Torah is his. And since now the rabbi has someone looking for? He's purchased Torah, in a way, or she has purchased Torah. Because of that, I now have liberty with it. I now have license to forego my dignity that I earned because of Torah. It's a very different way of thinking about it. Right, so Rava's first instinct was to say, you know what, a rabbi can't forego their dignity because they're really a representative of something that's not theirs. And then Rava thought about it again and say, actually, you know what? No, a rabbi does earn it through the education, right, through the study and things like that, so that what the rabbi is sacrificing is his own honor and not God's, right? Because, like, what he's sacrificing is the Torah that he earned or she earned. It's getting a little bit in the weeds there, but I want to make sure we're, like, sticking to the point. The point is that Rava ends up agreeing with Rav Yosef that even a rabbi can forego their honor. So now we had the first half of what we were looking at was that, like, the respect that a parent is due is something fundamental and basic, and it seems to, like, create a whole social structure in which we make sure that a whole category of people are taken care of when they can't defend for themselves anymore. And now, like, in the second half of this, now the question is, yeah, it sure seemed inherent, but now there's a lot of possibilities in terms of what you're allowed to forego for your own, I don't know, for whatever reasons you decide. Right? Rav Huna decided he wants to rip up his silk, and he's going to say, you know what, you don't need to owe me anything anymore. You don't need to accord me with dignity anymore. Like, one thing I want to make sure we don't lose is that the kind of the reaction that we can have to this is, I think, a good one. And it's one that the rabbis are trying to figure out too. Because you could look at this just from a liberal perspective, again, in terms of human rights. I have the right to forego my honor. I don't have to be treated this way. I get to decide how I want to be treated. Right? I am an individual, and I can decide how I want to be treated. And if I don't want to have that kavod anymore, it's machol. I'm done. I don't want it anymore. But another side of it, which is, I think, where the, like, wait a second, but can you do that is coming from, is paying attention to the way that has real social implications, theological implications. It ends up impacting the role, right? How we think of what it means to be a parent, how we think of what it means to be a teacher. Right? So, like, because really, when we talk about respect, again, what we're really talking about is priorities. So maybe, in a sense, the respect that we talk about is something that's so precious that it's not something you can just negotiate away. Maybe it's something that needs to be protected. And because of that, maybe you don't have the right to get rid of it. That's the question that we're kind of coming back to. So Rava ends up coming down on Rav Yosef's side that a teacher can forego their honor. But here we have another great Talmudic phrase that you'll see every once in a while. Ini, which is best translated as really? Are you sure? Right? So the rabbis, again, are never on one foot about anything. They're always hopping back and forth. And here we have a story. I wanted to kind of give a summary of it because there's a lot of names. Blah, 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 rabbis. A bunch of rabbis are at a party. They're specifically at one rabbi's son's wedding. Okay? They're the rabbi's son's wedding. And that the host of the party, the father of the groom, is going around and serving all these other rabbis. He served some of his colleagues, and they got up, right? They stood up because that's what you do when you respect somebody. But he served other of his colleagues, and they did not. They sat kind of like hanging out, just sitting back and letting him serve you drinks. Now, that's clearly a way of being casual and not treating him with respect. Now, this is the notion in which colleagues owe each other respect. Rabbis owe rabbis respect, right? It's the way in which you're at a board meeting and the CEO walks in. What do? You stand up, right? You stand up. Maybe people don't do that anymore. I'm actually pretty machmir about this personally in my own practice. Like if someone I consider a teacher walks into the room, I get up. I stand up. Also, if your parent has an aliyah, like if your parent is called to the Torah, a very common minhag, a very common practice is to stand while the parent has that aliyah. Right? Again, standing as a way of showing respect. Right? Like the way, in the 1950s, if you're on a date and your date walks in, you stand up, right? You stand up, it's a way of showing respect. We all get it. Standing as respect. Okay. So he's like, wait a second, what do you mean? Like, you're rabbis, and why are only some of you treated? So in other words, the offense that the rabbi took, getting angry, seems to be justified. Because he's saying, why are only some of you treating me with respect and not all of you? Don't we all owe each other respect here? And then we have another version of that story. And interestingly, the conclusion it comes to is that even so, some respect must be shown. So the story is originally intended to prove that rabbis should not be able to forego their honor. Why? Because what was the original situation? What's the father of the groom doing?
He's serving other rabbis.
Very good. He's serving them. That sure seems to be, and here's Susie thinking about your comments earlier, that sure seems to be a practical example of I'm foregoing my honor here because it's like God walking before you in the desert. I'm serving you. Right? Imagine, this is actually like a classic thing like a Rebbe would do. Imagine going to like a rabbi's house, right, for like Shabbos. Remember when we used to go to other people's houses? Imagine going to like a big, serious rabbi's house, right? Serious rabbi. And then the rabbi is the one who walks around serving everybody, like pouring their cup of kiddush. It would feel a little weird. Or maybe weird's the wrong word. It's clearly an intentional decision that the rabbi is making to do that. Right? I'm showing you, I'm foregoing my honor, and it's clear that I'm doing that. Right? That's a clear example of somebody saying, I'm normally accorded a certain amount of dignity. People pour my wine for me. But I'm going around and serving everybody because I am showing you the respect that normally I would be owed. Right? It's a big move, right? You would take it seriously.
But there's like a constant sort of flow of social norms where in some societies or whatever, like you said, there's like the person, like there's like a, what am I trying to say? It's almost disagreement between who's the person to be honored. Like when you have guests in your home, you're supposed to treat them like really respectfully, or is it that someone's invited you into their home, you're supposed to treat them really respectfully? Like it's always this wavering societal norm of what's the right thing to do, like depending on where you are.
Right.
So,
I remember being invited over to someone's home, and I after dinner I wanted to get up and help with dishes in the kitchen, and the host wouldn't let me, right? Because they don't let guests help, right? They take care of guests. They don't want to have guests help. I felt weird because I wanted to help. That's what I do as a guest, right? Oh, you're a guest. You pitch in. You help dry dishes or whatever. But I think this is exactly the thing, right? Because it's a move, right? The rabbi is doing something important. He's saying, listen, I'm sacrificing my dignity here. I'm pouring you the wine. I'm showing you respect. And the question then is, what do you have to do with that? Because it seems like the rabbi wants to have his cake and eat it too. He says, I want to pour you the wine. I want to sacrifice my dignity and show how generous I am, show how magnanimous I am. But I also want you to stand for me. right? It seems like, can you have both? And the answer comes to was kind of yeah. Because the Talmud says, yeah, on one hand, you can sacrifice your dignity and serve other people, but on the other hand, you can't forego it entirely. So it ends up now creating a kind of conditional response, a qualitative answer, rather than a full, like a yes or a no. Maybe being machal on your kavod, right? Maybe forfeiting your dignity isn't just a yes or no thing, but maybe in a way you can partially give it up by donating it to other people, being magnanimous and generous, and donating it by pouring the wine, right? Serving someone else. But still, they still have an opportunity to still serve you, right? To still respond and reciprocate that honor back to you. So maybe it's not an all or nothing thing, right? So it
And
seems like the Talmud ends up being less comfortable with agreeing with Rav Yosef to say, yes, a teacher can entirely forego their honor.
can I
And
ask a
maybe they have that
question
same
about this?
discomfort
Oh,
with all of
sorry.
these questions. Because maybe they're saying, yes, what it means for someone to forego.
Is it really laggy or is it just me?
What about
No, Josh
the
just froze.
what about the Hasidic rabbis who stop using the title rabbi and want to be referred to only by Reb?
Hi, sorry about that. I'm back. I think I got booted off.
Yeah, you were frozen.
How
You've been
long?
frozen a few times.
Not for long.
Okay. Yeah, I think I've had a little bit of unstable internet. Okay, so I'll just sum up here. But here, I think we're left with a really interesting, like the Talmud wants to keep this complicated. It wants to keep this complicated in a way that I find actually very, again, it's really about troubling the question, raising the good kashyas, right? The productive problems, rather than it really being about having the right answer. So we have, like, like always, we have a range of possibilities that the Talmud outlines. One is that in certain circumstances, like a parental relationship, it raises the possibility that you can forfeit your honor and have a more equal relationship. Then it seems like it has some discomfort, but then it raises another idea about a teacher-student relationship. Can you do that too? And then some way saying, well, I don't know, can you, says Rava 1, right? Rava says, I'm not sure if you can, because really you're a steward of something that we all hold transcendentally valuable. And because of that, you don't have a right to sacrifice it because it's not really yours. You are serving it, right? You are representing it. It's not really about what you get to do. It's about what you have to do. You're in service of it. But then Rava 2 says, on the other hand, a rabbi is like a professional too. And a rabbi earns their status through work, through study. And thus, because of that, maybe they do have a certain amount of liberty to negotiate that dignity away. And then we have, though, a Maisa, another precedent case, which says, sure, but we have this example of a rabbi serving their colleagues, and on one hand saying, I'm going to serve you in a very magnanimous way. It's my son's wedding. You come to me on the day of my son's wedding, right? I'm going to serve other people. But he still expects some respect in return. So maybe the Talmud is opening, like, again, a middle path in which saying, on one hand, we see the way in which we can define our relationships. Parents, children, teachers, students, we can redefine, adapt, kind of reapply these relationships according to what we think is best, right? So maybe there's a good reason for Rav Huna to forego his honor with his son. It's possible. Maybe it's the right case, right? Or maybe you're trying to, maybe your son is, or your child is in maybe like actually a possibility raised before. Maybe they're not doing too well financially. So you're going to forego your honor and say you're no longer obligated to me, right? You've hit the skids. I want to make sure that you're not going to go into debt taking care of me. I don't want that to be the end of our relationship, right? So there might be a completely compassionate reason to forego your honor, right? It might not just be trying to trick your son into getting mad at you, right? It might actually really be how to best take care of your child, or maybe it maps best to what your relationship would best look like. Or perhaps we don't have so much liberty to renegotiate these things, because what it's really about is that these relationships are telling us about what we think is important, right? What we value, what we prioritize in society. And for there to be a precedent set in which a parent can say, yeah, treat me like you treat everybody else, what does that end up communicating about how we treat those who brought us into the world, how we treat elders, right? How we treat those that that we literally owe everything to, or to treat a teacher, right, in a casual way, might also then be setting a bad precedent for what kind of honor we think Torah is accorded, right? So again, the Talmud is not just trying to is concerned with the bottom line law. It is trying to get us to a practical conclusion, but it's not just about that. It's about also trying to have us explore all the different sides of possibilities, but also all the different sides of what the question entails, right? What it really means, how it impacts our lives in all these different kinds of ways. So thanks for walking this path. Sorry about the connectivity issues. I'm just going to say quick announcements about what else we're offering at Beth Lida, and then I'll end the recording, and I still have some time to do some more discussion for those who want to stay on a little bit longer. So we have our weekly Parsha class. We'll be exploring Parshat Bo this Thursday at 7 p.m. Same link as always. We'll be having Havdalah online Saturday night at probably 6:10, I imagine, in the evening. Same link. We do Havdalah together, and we do a little bit of singing. And then last class in the series next Tuesday night, which is going to be great and very fun. Please email me course ideas. Always happy to do new ones. I think the next thing we're going to be doing after this class, I'm going to take a little bit of a break, but we're going to be doing the second volume of the Kabbalah class, which will be a historical journey through the different stages of Kabbalistic literature. So before we had kind of major topics, now we'll be having like a very methodical, major texts, major figures, period by period, and it will probably take a couple months. We'll really give it the time. I mean, it take your whole life, but we'll give it like a little bit more time. That'll be in starting in probably mid-February. And also a week from Thursday, Wednesday night, we're doing a joint program with Sha'arei Shamayim. We'll be having a Tu B'Shvat Tish together, and that will be their Zoom link. So that's on the email newsletter. And on Thursday night, we'll be doing a Tu B'Shvat Seder on Zoom, on our Zoom, this Zoom link. And there was an email that went out about the supplies and what you need, the fruits and the wine to get and everything. But if you have any questions to clarify what you need and like make sure you can do it on a budget, it does not need to be expensive. So just please feel free to reach out to my email, joshuaschwartz86@gmail. Thank you all so much for joining. And I'm going to stop recording. And please, and more insights and questions, we can have a little bit of time to chat. All right. Shkaya.